Is it going? All of you people out of town and here, this is not for the public tape. Just right quick, I wanted to say something. All the comments from me and other sources that the experience itself and the secret of life cannot be described. I feel quite certain by now that most of you figure you have your own understanding of that. That either it's too complex, too astounding, too plain, or that there's something metaphysical, a basis of which even you have no idea, that keeps it from being easily or directly explained. There's another aspect I've never mentioned that I was going to mention to you. Besides all of that, not coming one way or the other, but there's something else about it, and that is that the ordinary nervous system of man, there are aspects of it that were described, all human nervous systems immediately recoil from it. You never heard that before. Nobody ever saw fit to tell you, but there it is. Now fade out and quit living in Germany and Canada and California and come somewhere good like fade it out. If it doesn't bother you that all of life, including that of man's mind, operates automatically, then you're normal. If it doesn't bother you that all of life, including that of man's mind, operates automatically, then you don't know what it does. If it doesn't bother you that all of life, including that of man's mind, operates automatically, then it could be that you do know it, that you can remember it, and have discovered in your own head a mind possible beyond the mind. That's some mighty big ifs. Yeah, but we've some mighty big heads. Since man's first thought, each succeeding ones come on the premise that it will help clarify the preceding ones. On Donner, on Blitzen, on frontal lobes, you jokesters and tricksters. Using extensive effort, one man was able to count up to at least 3 different things his mind could think about at the same time. But notice that as soon as he got to 3, that he'd suddenly fall fully captive of one of them and lose all awareness of what he'd been doing. In traffic, all makes of cars can be equally sticky. Thus it be that all of man's selective attempts to become free therefrom fail. Regarding our previous legal determination that life is the ultimate culprit, consider then further that when there is nowhere to lay the blame, there is no blame. Silence is to certainty as talk is to aggression. Utilizing special effort, one man was able to count up to at least 3 different things that his mind was able to think about at the same time. And this doesn't include whatever part of his awareness that it is that made the count, which of course throws off the original count. Without understanding the self-laying tracks of the train of premises, such as that morality is established due to its non-existence, you can never fathom why cannibalism is the mind's proper after-dinner drink. There was once a band of people who involved themselves centrally in an activity that seemed to have no observable purpose. But just because this is how it appeared to reasonable outside eyes does not mean that that's the decisive word on the matter. Even though each mind pursues only those things that are in the best interest of the collective consciousness of man, to intellectually achieve anything individually, you must go far beyond this point. Stand aside for some definitions. Science, a form of encouragement for those who don't want the merry-go-round to ever run down. Religion, encouragement for those who fear that it will. Employing certain methods he had personally developed, one man was able to realize that his mind could entertain at least 3 different thoughts or sensations at the same time, some verbal, some visual, and some visceral, which still does not take into consideration whatever aspect of consciousness that it is that is capable of making such observations. In this one kingdom was a particular area which made the people disheartened. There was yet another which caused them to be cheerful. There was yet another region which produced in them anxiety and fear, and another bravery and aggression. And although the people had lived in this land for all of their days, few of them ever realized the source of their lives' sensations and took them to be self-affected. One reason it is hard to recognize the more conscious among ordinary man is that while they may live with him, they do not live like him. If you yet stand on your porch awaiting a sign, some sort of supernatural signal to lead you to the promised land of freedom, you will forever look awry. That is, to the traffic itself as the cause of your captivity, and not to your own looking thereto. It is tempting to say that a man's mind only thinks about things that are in its own best interest. But if you examine what it is normally concerned with, you're almost forced to reconsider your conception of what constitutes one's own best interest. What is brought forward again is the fact that the needs of man the collective and him the individual can diverge in ways not accounted for by the group. After you've seen what life is about, whenever you return to taking it seriously and personally, you undertake then to dream within a dream. Only the mind will act as an open cut that will further infect itself. Note, it is in a sense shabby, shameful, and less than accurate to describe the man in terms such as I just did. But without such a striking basis for comparison, 'tis extremely difficult to ever even get a brief glimpse of this most elusive, self-camouflaging creature. Oh, and also is the fact that it doesn't take all this personally anyway. Silence is to certainty as speech is to stupidity. The attraction of drugs is that they reinforce the limits of consciousness and speed up the already distracting tempo of thought. Note that such drugs need not be purchased, in that lower areas of the nervous system are still quite capable of turning them out nicely. I won't bother to specify which drugs, but I will hint to you that they have shorter titles and things like Squibb and Company or Park and Davies. No one can operate without a premise or a purpose, except a mystic. And him just barely. Call the tailor. No thought, no guilt. No thought, no moral outrage. Unacceptable tears in the collective civil fabric. No. Silence is to certainty as talk is to routine confusion. One man's interim enlightenment. I'm quoting. I have never stumbled or screwed up in life, but my mind was responsible. One more alert man's mind said to him one day, "Why have you singled out me for all of your intellectual criticism?" And the answer to that is self-evident, unless you let yourself get in the way of its obviousness. The fruits of man's mental life. More and more about more and more. Silence is to the freedom of certainty as talk is to the comfortable confinement of the porch. One man began thinking of a mystic as like the last guy to get on the train going to nowhere. And finally, some absurd health news. When treated by a Bodhi tree or the like, most people get better, even if they weren't sick. Back to the general area that we were conversing upon and about how far away a different state of consciousness, how far away the secret of life, how far away the union with God, how far away the embrace of the eternal lover, how far apart, how far away is the Buddha mind, the secret of the mysteries, all of that, how far away it is. And yet, if it was any closer, some people would feel like they need to call 911 and report a trespasser, perhaps a burglar, someone following way too close, a kind of spiritual form of sodomy, which one good attorney had lowered to following too close. That was near Sparta and not Georgia. The purpose, to remind you again, being not just to describe how far removed this sort of activity can be from ordinary activities, but the spatial, if nothing else, situation within one's own nervous system. I was going to shift it a bit tonight and point out to you that people do not do anything. And again, we're only speaking of reasonable, down the road, middle class, sane, ordinary, routine, everyday people. They will undertake nothing without some sort of premise. That is, it must have a purpose. And I was going to use premise as somewhat of or move it closer to man's intellect than to his simple survival level. The body obviously has a purpose in everything it does, again, assuming you're sane and ordinary. The body eats, the body sleeps, the body, collectively speaking, engages in the reproductive acts for its own good purposes. It is a sign of non-sanity for the body to engage in something that has no purpose or that has a purpose that is not in its own best interest. But let me say premise, and sort of the legal, if not philosophical sense of a premise. It is the either stated, but in our case now, collectively, it's the assumed, it is the tacit statement, the tacit acceptance that that which is being done has a purpose and is expected to reach a conclusion. Anything you take in civilization, we should take a vote and see if everyone agrees with me that it gets less and less interesting to specify selective examples from life. No, we can't do that, because then you'd have to select whether you agree with it or not and vote either yes or no. It's all of civilization. It's what I wish we could just say and get over with, but I know that that's not the way things work in the mind. Pick out any specific area in civilization. And by civilization, I'm again referring to the world of man's mind as much as we can verbally speak of it and refer to it apart from the world of the body. That is, things without which the body could survive. All the arts, the religions, the education, everything that seems to be, at the local level, a direct output of man's mind, not his body, and not from needs of his body, from some other need. That is civilization. Everything in civilization operates on a premise, and the premise is always this. And again, it is simple, I will assume, if I describe it in a certain way, and yet you should also notice that you never think about it that way, not because you're stupid and I'm smart. It's because the mind is not arranged to look at it in this way. But everything that a man's mind does, I slipped in a couple of disguised news items tonight, that apparently everything everything the mind does in a man, an ordinary sane man, is, collectively speaking, for the interest of the mind, in the best interest of the mind. And then later on in the news, it said it's tempting to say, without the qualifications of collectively, that it's tempting to say that everything that an ordinary, sane man's mind does is in its own best interest. It's tempting to say that. Ordinary people would say that, because they would say that contraire, if the mind is doing something not in its own best interest, that is proof itself that one has a diagnosable mental problem. That is, for the mind, for people to have a phobia, that they've got to change their socks every 2 minutes or they'll die. All sorts of phobias are considered to be that the mind operating in some way that's not in its own best interest. And forget all about all the theories about how this happened in some previous life or some subconscious area. The mind is operating in a way not in its own best interest. And that is considered, rightfully so from their view, as prima facie evidence that a person's mind is not sane and ordinary. So the news item I slipped in was, it's tempting to say that everything that an ordinary man's mind does is in its own best interest. But now consider, everything that the mind normally does under civilized conditions, also by the definition of civilized conditions and civilized purviews and context, implies that if it's not overtly a positive move, at least it's not a negative move. That is, anything that somebody comes up with a new novel, somebody comes up with an attempted new school of painting, and you may not see the point in it, but it will be in some way, if not observably, demonstrably to a large group of people immediately positive. The point is, it's not destructive, because the destructive aspect is not part of civilization. That's what I want you to keep in mind for a second. The way I'm using it is contraire, is expanded to ordinary people saying that we have destructive elements in our society, or there are destructive aspects in civilization. That's not true. Not from a better view. That which is destructive, criminal behavior, antisocial behavior, is by its very definition, if you see it, is outside civilization. So anything that is not destructive, by anybody's definition, not mine, but if it is not destructive to civilization, then in some way it can be seen as being in the best interest of the human mind. You individual, as I said, you may hear that this is the way, this is neo-minimalist music. And you hear a new symphony performed and you think, well, Jesus, I didn't even like minimalist 10 years ago. Now they got a minimalist revisited. And you can say, I don't see the purpose. It sounds nothing at all like Brahms or Schubert. This is not progress. Now that can be your view, you understand, just because of your taste. But you also must understand that even if classical music, serious music in the Western world, if it collapsed, you do realize, I shouldn't say that, just because there's a form of new serious music that is now being fostered and presented to the public as being the new thing, just because you don't like it, you've got to be sane enough to realize it's not the downfall of civilization. Even if it prevails for a few years and you have to quit going to the symphony because it's all way too modern and you don't like it, okay, I'm sorry. But you've got to realize it is not the end of civilization. Everything that transpires in civilization operates on an unsaid premise. The premise being that something is wrong. That is what has been forgotten. That is what the human mind, and I'm lying somewhat. I'm distorting it to say that the human mind forgot, because it never actually realized it. But we'll operate on that basis for a second. That the human mind does not move except on a premise. It is not, as always, no matter we verbally dissect it ephemerally for these discussions, but the mind does not operate without motivation any more than the body does. The motivation always being, the premise always being, that something is wrong. Consider the premise of all religions is that man is not up to par. They call it spiritually, that man is he's completely missing the mark. He has yet to grow up. He's yet to be a decent kind of guy and gal that God, should he show up, would be proud of. I mean, you're still kind of shabby and shameful, to quote something I heard. You're less than up to speed and par. That might seem obvious enough, but look at everything else in civilization. How about something that might seem as very far removed from religion, education? The premise of education is that you're dumb. And at first you might try to ignore that, or to say, well, it's too obvious, or it's too silly, or it's too silly to be obvious, or it's too obvious to even be silly. But no one ever states that premise. And if I present it that way, an ordinary person might say, that is, the ordinary part of your mind might say, well, all right, if you're going to just be semi-jocular, then maybe so. But you never think about that. The premise is you're stupid. The premise is you're dumb. The premise is you need help. And here it is, either Harvard or your local night school or community college giving courses at night in air conditioning repair. Whatever it is that you're stupid. That's the premise. Why else would you go to school? Now, people will say to increase their earning capacity and etc. But understand that everything that flows from the human mind, civilization, and every aspect in it, there is no exception, operates on a premise. And the premise is always that something is wrong, that there is a problem. The kind of activity that has always been referred to as the mystical comes as close as possible, according to how bad your hearing is, either comes as close as possible or is the only exception to that, because you can find no collective premise for attempting to do it. None. The best that people have ever done is these kinds of theoretical notions that continually pop up having to do with the assumed brotherhood of all religion. I don't know whether you see it, but that comes the closest to spurring man on beyond, to any possible point beyond a secular, selective local version of some extraordinary growth inside the individual, which is what religion in a sense should have been, or will claim that it is. But the so-called mystical way and effort in life is either the closest thing or the only exception to this, that there is nothing in the collective mind of man, that is, there is nothing in civilization that offers a premise for why someone should do this. None. And it's not to play woe as mystics or woe as would-be mystics, but until you understand. Time out. I have beat on this for more than one or two nights, that those of you who have been listening are aware of for different ways. And it's not to play, I can think of several ways ordinary people could look at it. It's not to play, what a strange and unappreciated effort this kind of thing is. How it's always been unappreciated, how not many people can hear it, why there is no immediate reason that you are not recognized, that there's no mystical playoffs every year, there's no mystical Super Bowl, there's no prize, the Nobel Committee does not offer prizes in mysticism. It's not all of that. All that's true, but so what? That's not the point. The point being that a person trying to find out where to start, how to keep oneself going, and people look for every possible reason, because there are many people born, or in one sense, as I put it, everybody's born wanting to be a mystic. Every person that's genetically sane. And that is to say that everybody who is just genetically sane and normal on this planet is born with the urge to grow, to develop. No matter how crude they may display it, that's the only reason that people engage in good grooming. Take a course in memory improvement. Go to school. Keep up their front yard. Get their car painted when it's rusty. Go to school, get a better job, save money, buy a bigger car. Go to church. Try and be decent. Give charity. Give to charity. Everything that an ordinary person does that is considered to be civil and decent is a form of, is an attempted expression of their desire to grow. That's what civilization is. That's all it is. So everyone, in a sense, everyone who is sane genetically, it wants to be a mystic. Everyone wants to be better. All sane people, that's one of the definitions of it. If you want it real plain, you know that. To be sane is to answer. If someone says, would you like to be a better person? And they detect no inflection, that they don't think you have some personal axe you're trying to grind, and suddenly give them a brochure from the Seventh-day Advertisers. If you just say, would you like to be a better person? The proof of sanity is you have to say yes. And I say you have to. All sane people automatically do say yes. You don't have to think about it. It's not applied. So everyone is attempting to grow. Then it gets into all the various stages amongst ordinary people, is then they want to select certain areas. They have to split up into different teams, or we wouldn't have the National League of wanting to be more awake and enlightened. That is, that they split up into Catholics and Jews and Buddhists and Republicans and Democrats and fascists and everything else. They divide up the playing field, which is dividing up, life has already done it up here in the playing field, into feeling though there's little groups of us. It's us possums against the hippos, or against the beavers, and the squirrels against the cats and the birds. And I am not now speaking in the physical do or die battle for survival, but even up in here. And it's just obvious as hell if you can get past that one little area in your brain that is staked out and told you that you are a Jewish libertarian from whatever, or that you're a Muslim fundamentalist. If you get away from that, you simply look and you realize that all of the divisions that seem to promote or seem to produce or seem to excite passion in people, whether you agree with it or not, whether it affects you or not, of even people arguing over music, of whether the music has just absolutely, in the Western world, let's say, has absolutely died since the classical era. I don't hear anything about romanticism. I know how popular it is, but no, every single. After Mozart, forget it. They can say that, and the people that would apparently get in a fist fight, at least they would get in a verbal fist fight in the letters to the editors of the New Yorker magazine or New York Times, they would do everything but bloody one's nose physically. So in all those areas, what I was saying is, once you see it, it's just obvious as hell, is there is no right and wrong. There is no better music, worse music. It is, in fact, in essence, it is cut up in that way to keep men from looking directly at the fact that all civilization is doing is making more and more out of more and more. Back to the main road. Everything in civilization operates on a premise in the mind, from the mind. And the premise being that something is amiss, that there is a problem. And that whatever is presented, such as religion, is here to fix it, or education. Religion should be obvious. And that should be easy for everyone to say, oh yeah, that's the whole point. No one partakes of any religion without feeling in some way that they are below par, that they are not living in a proper manner, that there is indeed a problem. And then I pulled out religion. I could have done science, but I was trying to keep it within the realms of superficial non-absurdity. Is that everything a person does is a reflection of them wanting to grow and expand, and on the basis that they should, and that there is a problem. They have long ago forgotten, although never knew upon what this is based. But you cannot make your mind do anything. You cannot find yourself being interested in anything without there being a premise to it. You just never think about it. But if somebody asked you, if you were damn near a fanatical philanthropist or whatever the you mummersis philatelist. That's the only use of I was going on. I just make my own joke. You can do it yourself. Someone who is damn near a fanatical stamp collector. I may be sorry I put my foot in this, but I can always get out. At any rate, something that an ordinary person is doing, and somebody says, how in the hell do you sit around, how do you spend such a large part of your life and disposable income on collecting stamps? I mean, somebody asks you that, sort of a friend, or that being real pushy about it. You will then offer, maybe for the first time in your life verbally, you will offer a premise. That is surely not the word you would use, but you'll say, well, all right, if you're really interested, I'll explain it to you. And you go, well, I am. It's beyond me. You will give a premise. You have never stated it, but you have operated on the basis that in front of the act, in front of the pursuit of the act, is at least an unstated assumption of what the purpose is. That's what a premise is. At the simplest level, people never think about it. If I'm making it too obscure, back to a physical level, which we're not talking about, to make a simple one, it's obvious. You say, let's go out, you tell them, somebody said, let's go out to that new restaurant. And they go, why in the hell do we want to go to a restaurant? No. And they say, what's the premise? Which they would never do, but you would think, well, the premise is to cure hunger. And they go, oh, okay. That's the premise. The mind always has a premise. And the premise is always on the basis that there is a problem. Religion, it's obvious, you can see that it operates on the basis of a problem. Education's a little trickier to see. But then consider everything else that goes on between those two extremes, or even past, like I said, even into science, even into things that apparently has very little to do with the individual. The problem being, well, I guess you're big enough to take science right quick. You can say, well, science has got nothing to do with such as this. It is as close as anything as being clinical, objective, and outside the real direct clutches of man's personal mind. All of science, all new theories, people working on new explanation of the cosmos or reality, or certain new observed operations of crystal growth, whatever it is, to them there's a problem in the premise of what their experiment. If you say, well, why in the world do you work here in the lab? Why do you keep going after these grants to keep studying such and such, which to me seems irrelevant to life? There is a premise. And the premise is we have a problem here. And it may be no more. They may not be able to explain to him more than the great idea of pure science, that they say, well, we have a problem. We don't understand why crystals operate in this manner. And you say, well, why the hell do you want to know? I mean, what's that hurting? And you go, well, it's a big hole in what we understand. And I cannot, the scientist may say, he may not be able to tell you, and he may admit, I cannot tell you right this second why us not understanding this certain phenomenon has a direct adverse effect on your life. But I can tell you this, since this is at the heart of computers, since this is the heart of all kinds of new uses of man-made materials, this will very shortly have a direct bearing, and could have a direct adverse bearing to the furthering of science and technology if we do not study it. Everything the mind does within the mainstream, genetically sound, middle of life's parade, operates on a premise. And the premise, no matter what it is, the premise is that there is a problem. That is not untrue, because the problem is that collectively man cannot see. The problem is that the mind cannot climb itself. The problem is the mind cannot cure itself. The problem is the mind cannot satisfy itself. The problem is, under all ordinary forms of nourishment, under all ordinary conditions, the mind cannot, in one man's lifetime, grow, expand to the point of satisfying the person. No one ever says that that's the problem. They're not supposed to. But that is the basis of the problem. Now what I'm trying to point to. As far as there being a collective, recognizable basis, motivation, thrust, premise for the individual undertaking such as this, there be none. This is as close as possible to an operation within life, which I must admit from three-dimensional descriptions, even my own, it's literally impossible, it being a closed system as far as the mind now sees. But it comes as close as possible as something that a person is attempting. And it's still not destructive. You got to remember, it's not insane or it's not destructive. But to attempt to do this individually is as close as there comes to the mind in a non-destructive way, operating on the basis that there is no problem. It is the mind getting out of bed every morning, which this particular bed, there is no reason whatsoever to ever get out of. For all of you, or all of us who enjoy a nice, cozy bed, for all of those fine, civilized, decent, many times intelligent and talented people who could damn near live in bed, I'm not saying anything. Or put the other way, for all people, all civilized, decent, right-thinking, talented, good-looking, punctual people who almost every morning wake up and think, you know, I don't ask much in life. I don't care whether I win the state lottery or ever get famous, but God, I wish I didn't have to get out of bed. All right. But you do. You got to get out of bed to live physically. You have to get out of bed intellectually to live. This comes as close. What the few people in life that ever retain the awareness of what it is or run across what seems to be somebody involved with it. So they've held some awareness of it. Then to get involved with such as this and be confronted and have some notion of what it is, or to begin with, maybe have somebody try to beat you or to shame you or to tell you, well, now here's what you should be doing. This comes as close to being one bed. So you got several beds. Well, you got the physical bed that you got to get up each day, and then you got the mental bed, because some days you have to, every day you got to get up physically. But some days mentally you don't have to get up, like Saturday, your off days. But so understand that you've got more than one bed in which we sleep. But this sort of activity comes the closest to being a bed that you wake up. There's only a few people even find themselves in that bed. But this comes to one if you find yourself that you wake up and there is no reason whatsoever to get up. In other words, it's the one place you think, I don't have to get up. What a great amount of satisfaction, right? Wrong. Because it sounds like it is, except this is the most unsettling, nettling, annoying, irritating. I mean, once you realize you're in this bed, it's almost like you and the bed both begin to bounce up and down. You don't know whether you're on the bed or it on you. Like, you know, we got to get up. But back to, all right, I couldn't resist dragging out the metaphor even further in the beginning, but back to what I'm saying. You realize, or you come to some suspicion, you come to some almost damn conviction that this sort of thing, whatever it's been called, you just pick out one and attempt to enlighten oneself, that this is it. And you get some idea what it is, and you find yourself in that kind of bed, that you periodically are aware of the fact that besides physically and mentally, that you may have no complaint necessarily with what's going on in life, but you sleep in at least 3 beds, or at least you're aware of it periodically. This is the one bed that there is no premise, there is no problem, there is no reason to try and arise from. Maybe I better at least stand this allegory and parable upright. The attempt to do this is not based upon any observable, collectively based problem. All right, let me use, everybody seems to always enjoy a little history. Whether I mean this literally or not, again, doesn't matter. But let me pick out probably the best one, Buddha. Remind you again, whether he existed or not, it's not even the point. There is now an accepted story and a history of it. And it's accepted to be a description of, besides it finally turning into an organized religion, so to speak, but is one of the fair descriptions of what's assumed to be a life spent in the mystical struggle and a success therein. And all the other religions are the same way, and all the other publicly, commonly known mystical systems, etc. But let's use the story of Buddha. Here's a guy who spent many, many years, pursued everything, and the idea of being more awake, being more conscious, he did not discover. He grew up in it, had been around for thousands of years in that area of the world. He did not invent any new terms for it. He pursued all the known methods that all the yogas, all the gurus, all the would-be spiritual people that were attempting the same thing. He pursued all the methods. He and his 12 buddies. that he ended up with. And none of it worked. He then says, I've had enough of this. And he split off from him and said, I'm either going to die or I'm going to figure out what this is. I'm abandoning all this other efforts. I'm going over there and sit down, and I'm not going to get up. I don't care if I die, but I'm not getting up until I find out what the hell this is, until I have the experience. And as luck would have it, according to literature, sure enough, he sat there for a while, and suddenly the thing hit him. And then it says they sat there a while longer, even after that. They started to get up, and he sat back down, and he thought, no, that's not it. That's not all of it. Now I got to figure out, because he just knew he was going to say something, or he knew he'd run across his buddies. He knew something. He knew, let's put it that way, he knew that he'd have to go back and tell his 12 buddies, because after all they'd been through, if nothing else, he'd go back and tell them. So he started to get up, and then he thought, wait a minute, I got to think of something. I got to think of some way to put this. So then, supposedly, he sat there until he figured out what he was going to say. So then he gets up and he goes and finds his 12 buddies, and they take one look at him, and they go, uh-oh, you did it, didn't you? And they say, okay, what is it? And he said, all right, you got your pads and pencils. Then, in a sense, he had to lie, because he started out his very first words, more or less, me just paraphrasing it, he says, all right, are you ready? I'm going to describe, I have succeeded, what we've all done. It just happened to me, and I came back to tell you guys, because I knew, we're buddies, we're all through it. I happened to do it, and you didn't. And they go, well, tell us. And no doubt, they had no doubt that he knew. So they got their pads and pencils. And he said, all right, here it goes. Here's the premise. Although he didn't say that. He said, here's the premise. Now skip that, strike that, and let's go back to what he did say, supposedly, more or less. He says, all right, here we go. You ready? And they went, ready. He said, to live is to suffer. And they didn't bother to write that. That was his opening words. That was his first sermon. That was his first recorded, official, enlightened-based comment. Not to even the public. This is to the 12 people that he had been searching and working with all those years. He says, you ready? And they went, ready. He says, to live, to be alive, is to suffer. They didn't write that down. It was an accepted premise. Mm-hmm. And this is not something that is just indigenous to the subcontinent. It wasn't just something that was common to Indian thought at that time. You understand? That is the premise of everything in civilization, especially that which seems to get into areas that have to do with man's spirit. I'm going to repeat it again. Do you understand? Here it is, the opening words. These 12 people been searching, spent their whole life would have given anything, and out of the 13, one of them did it. And he said, all right, I'm going to tell you. And they got their pads and pencils. And he said, are you ready? Buddha's first sutra, first real comment to explain enlightenment. They go, ready? He goes, all right, here we go. First, to live is to suffer. To be alive is to suffer. They're all poised, yeah? Because that's a given. They didn't bother to write it down. And he had to know that. They go, okay, comma, dash. And here are the ways not to suffer. And they're going. And we're not talking about Buddha and 12 monks sitting out in the wilds of India. It's the news. It's the news today. It's the news of history. It is apparently the verbal news from someone who understands what life is, even though he doesn't say it. But if he doesn't say it, all right, we got a premise here. I've been struggling to do what you want to says Buddha number 27 shows up today in Detroit somewhere. And some people show up, and he says, all right, to be alive is to suffer. And they think, it's obvious you are from Detroit. No, it's obvious you're from planet Earth. It's obvious that you are still operating at the level of the mind, which can only operate by binary energy, by polarized energy. You cannot speak. The Buddha, again, remember we're not speaking literally whether this happened or not, but the Buddha, what that represents, an enlightened mind, an enlightened consciousness, could not even talk to those who his closest cohorts, those that were just, let's say, it was just a luck of the draw that he made it and the 12 didn't. That he did it first. And they went, well, we've almost wrecked our lives. We spent this time. Why not take advantage of it? If you can describe it, he said, all right, I'm going to give it my best shot. You're my buddies. But he had to start off with the accepted premise, which is a lie. And trust me, he knew it was a lie. A lie didn't mean much. He knew it's not true. To live is to suffer. And they take that as, yeah. Of course, physically, we all know that. You can say to live is to suffer, if that makes you feel better. Are we going to, do I have to go through the cheap theatrics of that again? If suffering makes you feel better. Oh, okay. Physically, to be alive, certainly is to suffer. And those of you that might have read anymore, that, of course, now is taken amongst the orthodoxy, or those that consider Buddhism. Anybody that considers Buddhism now a religion and a following thereof, that seems to be, oh yeah, what a compassionate. In fact, since he died, in case you never noticed the books up on the shelves, he is known now in the religious form as the compassionate Buddha. And it seems to fit, because his first words were, after he was enlightened, to live is to suffer. And of course, all the simple people, be they Buddhists, be they Southern Baptists, be they fundamentalist Muslims, be they ordinary people, they go, yeah. Because if you live long enough, if you pass adulthood, your mother, your father is going to die. Your brother or sister is going to die. You're going to get sick. You may nearly die. You may be suffering from some terminal disease now. You look upon life, and it's just nothing but death. It's death and suffering physically. Of course, if you didn't have the mind, you wouldn't even know that. You do not see dogs standing around graves for their mother or father. You do not see birds fearing death. Without the mind, all that's irrelevant. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, because animals die too. But it is above this line that a human is only here, that a human is worthy to be called a human. Just between you and me, you know that. Ordinary people admit it, and then immediately ignore it. But he had to say, once he started talking, to live is to suffer. No, yeah. Because that was the premise. Even they accepted it. They didn't bother to write it down. It wasn't like, whoa, let us think about this. You're going too fast. See, he hadn't even got to the sermon. He hadn't gotten to his comments regarding enlightenment. He said, all right, you ready? Yes. To live is to suffer. Yeah. He knew that wasn't going right. And he says, and here is Buddha's way. Here is the Four Noble Truths regarding suffering, and then I'm going to give you the 8 ways to avoid it. And they went, now we're getting somewhere. A Buddha knew that that's not true. But what else are you going to say? Reminding you again that we're not talking about Buddha and 12 monks. We're not talking about any two people. It's in your own nervous system. Because as long as you believe that there's a problem, as long as you believe that intellectually, now forget physically, because you're going to get sick and die. We're talking intellectually. That's all this is about. It's in the higher end of the nervous system. As long as you believe that there's a problem, as long as you, every time you think about trying to do this, the best you can make out of it, the best you can take out of something I said, or things you figured out yourself, or things that you feel like it's got to be true. But as long as you feel like, well, that's got to be true and I'll work on it, you're already getting the fingers. You think, well, I got to work on that. You're standing on the porch. And I use my current one. You're born here on a porch up here, and there's traffic going by, known amongst the ordinary sane people as their thoughts. It never stops. When it stops, you'll be dead, brain dead. There's the traffic. And there's parts of traffic that no one cares for. But they take it personally. They believe that it's based upon something, some selective intelligence, some individual understanding, that it's obvious there are people who go by driving too fast. There are people that go by driving in the wrong direction, especially. I'll be damned. There goes an Arab. There goes a Muslim. There goes an Italian. There goes a Greek. Some of them playing their radios too loud. Some of them doesn't have a radio. Some of them say that music sucks. No matter what is going on through here, if you take it personally, and you think, well, I've got to work on that. This is so sticky that my descriptions about that kind of exceptional polyurethaning of one's porch that is there when you're born, even that sounds to be an anemic metaphor. Mm-hmm. Because as long as you hear Buddha, the enlightened one, as long as you hear him to say, all right, are you ready? Inside your own nervous system, you hear what you think is the voice of the future, the voice of higher consciousness, and it says, are you ready? And you go, am I? And you're poised. And even to yourself, you go, no. I was going ahead and say to live is to suffer, but it doesn't matter as long as you think that there's a premise. Because if you think that there's a premise to this, the premise is always on the basis that there's a problem. Mm-hmm. Of course, in a sense, if you want to accept the English translation, suppose of what Buddha said, it shows you what a sense of humor. Because he picked out the worst possible example. He said, to live is the problem. You just don't hear it that way. Well, I was hoping maybe. In other words, if he'd been just sort of a routine mystic, or without that kind of good-natured sense of humor, he would have said something like, to be alive in India circa 500 BC is to suffer. Or, he might have said to people, to be poor, to be of the non-royal class is to suffer. To be a farmer is to suffer. To be uneducated is to suffer. Or he could turn to be dark-skinned, to be an Indian is to suffer. To be a woman is to suffer. He could have said all sorts of things. And of course there are plenty of religions and factions and sects that are based upon that. And politically, not just religiously. But, well, anyway, some of you heard it. I couldn't resist still trying to make the rest of you. Even if Buddha said that, and even him knew that he was lying, that he had to say something, he knew that their minds, even the best minds he knew, his 12 buddies, that they immediately heard that, yeah, the premise is that we got a problem, so, and he said, to live is to suffer. And they went, well, that's kind of the standard Hindu view. That was part of if there was such a thing as a Hindu orthodoxy view of being more enlightened, the whole point was to get outside that continual, as it's called now, circle of being completely being reborn and then dying and reborn, because it's all suffering. It doesn't get you anywhere. If it gets you anywhere and you keep living a better life, every time you come back you're still going to suffer because you're going to die. And enlightenment was supposed to be, from one view, to get outside that, just to go beyond it and be through with it. So it was accepted. That was part of the intellectual climb of the time and the place. That to live is to suffer. But I'm telling you, if he said that, which is quite possible, that's not even the point. But what a jokester, what a trickster, because he didn't even pick out something simple that you could almost defend. He picked out the worst possible example to use. To live is to suffer. In other words, he's saying all of life sucks, not just certain parts. To be alive is the problem. Except ordinary people, they keep repeating that. They don't hear it. To live is to suffer. And everybody goes, well, yeah, because it is true from their view. But if you change it and say, wait a minute, this is a faulty premise if you're trying to do something intellectually or spiritually, whatever you call it. If I was talking to somebody, forget physically, it is to suffer. It's to get boils and gingivitis, because they hadn't cured it. It's to suffer. And everybody goes, yeah. And you say, well, forget that. We're speaking about somewhere spiritually, intellectually. And they go, okay. Then this idea that to live is to suffer, you take that and they go, yeah, metaphorically. I see that also at a higher level, because I suffer that I cannot reach enlightenment. Or I suffer because my mind sometimes gets very aggressive, very hostile toward other people, and I know that's not beneficial. So I know that to live even here is to suffer. He was a kidder, I'm telling you. The man was a kidder because he wasn't that specific. Now he said to be alive is to suffer. In other words, what he said was, all right, I'm going to tell you people the problem. They said, okay. And he said, the problem is to be alive. Suffering sounds better in English. But even if he said that and you've given a few months or a few thousand years, people would accept that. Being alive is the problem. But you hear what I'm saying? That right now, that would not have sold as well. That would not have gone amongst the crowd there, as well as to live is to suffer. That sounds right, but to say to live is the problem. Mm-hmm. You've got nothing to do with that. You know, wait a minute, you're saying that just being alive is the problem. Mm-hmm. Trust me, he was a kidder. I mean, he realized, as long as I got a lie, I'm going to tell one that is so outrageous, that is so consuming, no one will ever see through it. He didn't want to anyway. But he had to say something. Yeah. Now back to you and yourself. Every time that you think, well, I should... Now, we're not talking about destructive habits. One more time. Although there's nothing physically, directly, a person can do to affect awakening consciousness to some other level. There are things you can do that will obviously directly interfere. You know, drugs, alcohol, anything harming the body. So we're not talking about the negative aspects and not undoing them. That doesn't come into account. But every time you think, besides anything such as that, when you are confronted with what the nervous system is normally confronted with, and here, operating this two-sided brain running on in a three-dimensional world, that the only reason the unstead spoken premise is, for me to try to affect this in any way, the premise is, what it is now is suffering. The way it is now is the problem. That I am going to rearrange traffic. Perhaps I'll get out there and I can, not just my own, but perhaps, I shouldn't even say my own, most people are not that sharp, that if I can get out there and straighten out traffic, if I can get everybody running down the same side of the street religiously or politically, if I can get people to do so and so, I would be better off. The traffic would not drive me crazy. I tried to point out to you tonight, as long as you think that looking upon traffic, that there's selective parts of it that are the problem, you'll never see that it's you're looking at the traffic that's the problem. And when you see that, I ought to quote myself again, when it reaches the point that there is nowhere to lay the blame, there is no blame. When you realize that there is no problem, then there's no problem to work on. Or worse yet, when you realize there is no premise, you think, wait a minute, that almost means there's nowhere to go. Yeah, except you can't say nowhere to go, because then you're kind of stuck with that dangerously childish, carrying your watch pocket aphorism that, well, hell, we're all enlightened right this second, just don't know it. People's always like that one, but it's not exactly true. I mean, it's real damn close. Now, I'll give you that. It's real close. It's as close as your foot is to the porch itself. But to say that we just don't know it, you just don't know what it is. You just don't know what the idea of a premise, an unspoken premise, does to trying to affect consciousness. Final hint, again, and I know this is not the best in the world. It may be. Of why I keep, for the time being, making a distinction between the mind and consciousness. I could have called it mind one and mind two, or consciousness one and consciousness two. People have been doing it forever. Sleeping consciousness, awakened consciousness, the captive mind, and the liberated mind. The strongest hint I was trying to lay out, again sideways, is that the mind, your ordinary mind, no matter who you are, will not attempt anything without there being a premise. And the premise is always that there is a problem, that there is something that I should be doing. There's a problem here, and to ordinary would-be mystics, the problem is I'm not awake or I'm not enlightened. That's the problem. And to say the least, it's very difficult to deny that. I mean, what are you going to say to somebody? That's not your problem. Because then all they're left with is, oh, you're saying that we're all awake and just don't know it. No. Just try this. Tattoo a right in a ballpoint, screw a premise. And do that until next time.